The snow fell upon the Kentish countryside with the particular insistence peculiar to the week before Christmas, transforming the rolling hills into an endless expanse of pristine white that rendered all roads treacherous and all communication with the outside world uncertain at best. Within his comfortable London flat, Hercule Poirot sat before a crackling fire, his small, precise fingers adjusting the perfect symmetry of his magnificent moustache, as he contemplated the curious invitation that had arrived with the afternoon post. The envelope had been of heavy cream vellum, its surface bearing the embossed crest of Ashcroft Manor, and within, a card expressed the fervent hope that Monsieur Hercule Poirot might grace the Blackwood family with his presence for their annual Christmas gathering. What had arrested Poirot's attention, however, was not the formal invitation itself, but rather a second sheet of paper, folded small and tucked behind the card, upon which a feminine hand had written in evident haste and distress a single desperate plea. Monsieur Poirot, I beg you to attend. There has been a threat upon my life, connected to the Ashcroft Garland, and I fear that someone in my own family means to murder me before Twelfth Night. I cannot trust the police with such accusations, but your reputation for discretion and brilliance gives me hope. Please come. Lives may depend upon it. The note was signed simply E.B. Poirot had made certain discreet inquiries through his network of connections, those invaluable individuals who moved through English society, gathering information with the diligence of bees gathering pollen. What he learned had been most illuminating. The Blackwood family, though possessed of considerable estates and an ancient name, had fallen upon difficult circumstances in recent years. Sir Edmund Blackwood, the current baronet, had inherited a title rich in history, but increasingly poor in liquid assets. His late father having made a series of spectacularly ill-advised investments in railway schemes that had come to nothing. The family's financial difficulties were compounded by the need to maintain Ashcroft Manor, a sprawling Tudor pile whose upkeep consumed funds at an alarming rate. More intriguing still were the whispers about the Ashcroft Garland itself. This was no ordinary Christmas decoration, but rather a priceless artifact, an intricate creation of gold and emeralds fashioned in the 16th century by Italian craftsmen for the first Sir Edmund Blackwood, favourite of Queen Elizabeth. Legend claimed the garland had been a gift from the Queen herself, though whether this was historical fact or romantic invention remained unclear. What was certain was its value, conservatively estimated at £50,000, and its peculiar history. The garland was displayed each year at Christmas, hung in the Great Hall for the 12 days of the season, then returned to the family vault until the following year. Tradition held that any Christmas during which the garland was not displayed would bring doom upon the house of Blackwood. 3 days later, Poirot found himself in a hired motorcar making its way with painful slowness along snow-choked lanes toward Ashcroft Manor. His driver, a stolid Kent man of few words, had expressed grave doubts about completing the journey, but Poirot's determination had prevailed, aided by the promise of generous compensation. As they rounded a final bend and the manor came into view, Poirot felt his breath catch, despite himself. The house rose from the white landscape like something from a medieval illumination, all gables and chimneys and mullioned windows, its ancient stones softened by the falling snow into an almost dreamlike quality. A footman in livery admitted him, taking his coat and hat with practiced efficiency, while expressing surprise that Monsieur Poirot had managed to reach the manor at all, given the state of the roads.
Sir Edmund and Lady Blackwood will be most pleased, sir. They had quite given up hope that you would arrive. The other guests came 2 days past, just before the worst of the snow began.
Poirot was shown to a comfortable guest room on the second floor, where a fire burned cheerfully, and his luggage had already been unpacked with impressive speed. He took the opportunity to refresh himself and to restore his moustache to its customary perfection, before descending to the drawing room, where he had been informed the company would be gathering for tea. The drawing room at Ashcroft Manor was a magnificent chamber, its walls panelled in dark oak and hung with family portraits dating back centuries. A massive Christmas tree dominated one corner, its branches laden with candles and ornaments that caught the firelight in dancing reflections. But it was the object hanging above the marble mantelpiece that immediately drew Poirot's attention and held it with almost hypnotic intensity. The Ashcroft Garland was even more remarkable than the descriptions had suggested. A flowing creation of gold leaves and emerald berries, so cunningly wrought that it seemed almost alive, as if at any moment it might stir in some impossible breeze.
Magnificent, is it not?
A cultured voice spoke at Poirot's shoulder. He turned to find a man of perhaps 55, tall and spare, with the bearing of one accustomed to command, though now somewhat diminished by care. This could only be Sir Edmund Blackwood himself.
My ancestor commissioned it from Benvenuto Cellini's workshop, or so the family tradition claims. Whether Cellini himself had a hand in its creation, or whether it was merely one of his apprentices, has been debated by scholars for generations. But there is no debate about its value or its beauty. It is indeed a work of surpassing artistry,
Poirot replied, studying the piece with the attention to detail that characterized all his observations. The garland measured perhaps 5 feet in length, its golden leaves so delicately formed that they seemed to tremble with the heat rising from the fire below. The emeralds were of exceptional quality and size, each one perfectly matched to its fellows, creating an effect of unified brilliance that spoke of extraordinary craftsmanship. And it has been in your family's possession since its creation? 400 years without interruption, passed from father to son through 14 generations. It has survived civil war, plague, fire, and revolution. It is perhaps the most valuable single object the family possesses, certainly more valuable than the house itself. Sir Edmund's voice carried a note of bitterness that seemed disproportionate to the topic, though there are those who would be happy to see it sold to settle our debts. Before Poirot could pursue this intriguing statement, other members of the household began entering the drawing room. Lady Blackwood proved to be a woman of perhaps 45, still handsome despite lines of care about her eyes, who greeted Poirot with a warmth that seemed genuine, despite an underlying tension he could not help but detect. She was followed by a younger woman, whom she introduced as her daughter, Miss Eleanor Blackwood, a pale and nervous creature of perhaps 23, who started visibly when Poirot bowed over her hand. It was Eleanor who had written the desperate plea, Poirot felt certain. The handwriting matched, and the initial E.B. corresponded to her name. But why had she not signed her full name? And why did she now avoid meeting his eyes, her gaze skittering away whenever he attempted to engage it?
Interesting. Most interesting indeed. A gentleman of military bearing entered next, introducing himself as Major Henry Thornton, brother to Lady Blackwood. He shook Poirot's hand with a grip that was, perhaps, unnecessarily firm, his manner carrying that particular hearty joviality that often concealed less pleasant characteristics. "Delighted you could join us, Monsieur Poirot. Eleanor has been quite insistent that we should have your company for Christmas. She has read accounts of your cases with great enthusiasm." So, Eleanor had made her invitation to him known to the family, though presumably not the desperate private note. This suggested either considerable courage or considerable desperation, possibly both. Poirot filed this information away, his keen mind already beginning to construct theories. The company was completed by the arrival of 3 more individuals. First came Dr. Marcus Ashford, the family physician, a man of perhaps 60, with the tired eyes of one who has seen much suffering and the gentle manner of one who has dedicated his life to alleviating it. He was accompanied by his daughter, Miss Victoria Ashford, a handsome woman in her 30s who carried herself with quiet dignity despite clothing that suggested somewhat straitened circumstances. Finally, there entered a young man whom Sir Edmund introduced with visible reluctance as Mr. Gerald Forsyth, a distant cousin who had come to stay for the season. Forsyth was perhaps 30, with the dissipated look of one who had lived too quickly and too carelessly. His evening clothes, while well cut, showed signs of age, and there was something in the way his eyes lingered on the Ashcroft Garland that suggested a man calculating values rather than admiring beauty. When he shook Poirot's hand, his palm was damp, and his smile failed to reach his eyes. Tea was served with the elaborate ritual appropriate to a house of Ashcroft Manor's standing, though Poirot noted, with his characteristic attention to detail, that the silver service, while beautifully maintained, was of an older pattern than the current fashion, and the china, though exquisite, showed the careful repairs of pieces too valuable to discard, but too damaged to display without embarrassment. These small signs of genteel poverty spoke volumes about the family's true circumstances. The conversation during tea was determinedly cheerful, touching on safe topics such as the weather, the difficulties of travel, and plans for Christmas festivities. But beneath this surface pleasantness, Poirot detected currents of tension, unspoken conflicts, and suppressed anxieties. Major Thornton spoke too loudly and laughed too readily, his joviality forced and his eyes constantly assessing the others. Gerald Forsyth made several attempts to engage Eleanor in conversation, attempts she deflected with increasing desperation, until her mother intervened with a smoothness born of long practice. Dr. Ashford maintained a professional remove, observing rather than participating, though his daughter Victoria attempted to keep the conversation flowing with the determination of one accustomed to smoothing over social difficulties. It was as the tea things were being cleared away that Lady Blackwood rose from her chair with an air of purpose. "Eleanor, dear, would you be so kind as to play for us? I know Monsieur Poirot would enjoy hearing you perform. Her playing is quite accomplished," she added, turning to Poirot. "She has inherited the musical talents of my side of the family." Eleanor rose with evident reluctance and moved to the piano that occupied one corner of the drawing room. As she arranged her music and settled herself at the instrument, Poirot observed that her hands were trembling. She began to play, and immediately it became apparent that her mother's praise had not been mere politeness. Eleanor possessed genuine talent, her technique sure, and her interpretation sensitive. She had chosen a Bach prelude, and as the complex patterns of notes filled the room, Poirot found himself thinking that there was something in the mathematical precision of Bach's composition that appealed to his own methodical mind. But his attention was not fully absorbed by the music. Instead,
He observed the reactions of the assembled company. Sir Edmund listened with closed eyes, his expression suggesting that he found temporary refuge from his cares in his daughter's playing. Lady Blackwood smiled with maternal pride, but could not entirely suppress the worry that tightened her features. Major Thornton appeared bored, his fingers drumming impatiently on the arm of his chair. Gerald Forsyth watched Eleanor with an intensity that Poirot found distinctly unsettling, though whether this was the intensity of admiration or of calculation, he could not immediately determine. Dr. Ashford and his daughter sat slightly apart from the others, and it was their reactions that most intrigued Poirot. The doctor listened with the absorption of one who genuinely appreciated music, but his daughter kept her gaze fixed not on Eleanor, but on the Ashcroft Garland above the mantelpiece. Her expression was difficult to read, a complex mixture of longing, resentment, and something else that Poirot could not quite identify. When Eleanor concluded her performance, there was polite applause, and Lady Blackwood invited the company to dress for dinner, which would be served at 8 o'clock. As the guests dispersed to their rooms, Poirot lingered, ostensibly admiring the Christmas tree, but in reality, hoping for an opportunity to speak privately with Eleanor. His patience was rewarded when she approached him with the obvious determination of one who has screwed her courage to a difficult point.
Monsieur Poirot,
she began in a low voice, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard.
You received my note.
I did indeed, mademoiselle. It was most intriguing. Tell me, what is the nature of this threat you mentioned?
Eleanor's pale face grew even paler.
3 days ago, I received a letter. It was unsigned, composed of words cut from newspapers in that horrid fashion one sees in sensational stories. The message said that I would not live to see Twelfth Night, that the Ashcroft Garland would be my death, and that those who cling to the past must pay the price of their pride.
You have this letter?
I burned it. I was frightened, and I acted without thinking. But, Monsieur Poirot, that was not the only incident. 2 nights ago, I awoke to find my bedroom door standing open, though I distinctly remembered locking it. And when I rose to close it, I saw a figure in the hallway, shrouded and silent, watching my room. When I called out, it vanished.
You told no one of this?
I told my parents of the letter, though not of the figure in the hallway. They dismissed it as a cruel prank, perhaps perpetrated by one of the servants. But I know it was more than that. Someone in this house wishes me dead, and I believe it has something to do with the garland. Please, you must help me. I feel as though I am going mad, suspecting everyone, trusting no one.
Poirot's expression became grave.
Mademoiselle, I shall certainly investigate this matter with all the resources at my disposal. But I must ask you a difficult question. Why did you not sign your full name to the note you
enclosed with the invitation? Eleanor glanced toward the doorway, then leaned closer.
Because I was not certain the letter would reach you unopened. My father has been under great strain lately. His financial difficulties are severe, and there has been pressure from various quarters to sell the garland to settle debts. I did not want him to know that I had written to you, that I had made public, even to so discreet a person as yourself, the family's troubles and my fears.
And yet you told the family that you had invited me?
I said only that I admired your work and thought you would be an interesting addition to our Christmas gathering. My mother was pleased by the idea, as she has been worried about me and thought the distraction would be beneficial.
Before Poirot could ask further questions, Lady Blackwood reappeared in the doorway.
Eleanor, dear, you should go and dress for dinner. And, Monsieur Poirot, I hope your room is satisfactory.
Most satisfactory, madame. The hospitality of Ashcroft Manor is all that one could desire.
But as Poirot made his way upstairs to his chamber, his mind was already at work, organising facts, noting inconsistencies, and constructing preliminary theories. Someone had threatened Eleanor Blackwood's life in connection with the Ashcroft Garland. Someone had entered her room by night, a feat that required either a key or considerable boldness. Someone in this isolated household, cut off from the world by snow and circumstance, was planning murder. The little grey cells, as Poirot fondly termed his mental faculties, were fully engaged. He would need to observe carefully, to listen attentively, and to detect the patterns that others missed. For if his long experience had taught him anything, it was that threats such as Eleanor described were rarely idle. Death had come to Ashcroft Manor as surely as the snow that continued to fall outside the windows. It remained only to discover whose hand would strike the blow, and to prevent it before another life was sacrificed on the altar of human greed, hatred, or desperation. Dinner at Ashcroft Manor was a formal affair, conducted with the elaborate ceremonial of an age that was rapidly passing away. The dining room was magnificent, its walls lined with portraits of Blackwood ancestors who gazed down with expressions ranging from stern disapproval to benign indulgence. The table itself could have seated 20 with ease, and the 8 diners gathered at one end seemed almost lost in its expanse. Crystal and silver gleamed in the candlelight, and the food, though not extravagant, was excellent, speaking well of the cook's abilities despite the household's financial constraints. Poirot found himself seated between Lady Blackwood and Victoria Ashford, a position that afforded him an excellent opportunity to observe the entire company while engaging in the polite small talk that custom demanded. He noted that Eleanor sat as far from Gerald Forsyth as the arrangement of the table permitted, and that Forsyth seemed oblivious to, or unconcerned by, her obvious discomfort in his presence. Sir Edmund presided at the head of the table with a distracted air, his attention constantly drifting to the doorway, as if he expected some unwelcome visitor to appear at any moment. Major Thornton dominated the conversation with a series of anecdotes about his military service in India, stories that grew increasingly improbable as the wine circulated. Dr. Ashford listened with the patient courtesy of one who has heard these tales before, interjecting occasional questions that encouraged the Major to continue. It was skillfully done, Poirot observed, a physician's technique for managing a difficult patient applied to social circumstances. "You must find our little gathering quite dull compared to your usual exciting cases, Monsieur Poirot," Victoria Ashford said during a lull in the Major's monologue. Her voice was pleasant, cultured, and carried an undertone of intelligence that Poirot found appealing. "We are merely a country family, observing the Christmas season in the traditional manner." "On the contrary, mademoiselle, I find all human gatherings fascinating," Poirot replied. "For wherever people assemble, there are the complexities of human nature to observe, the small dramas of daily life to appreciate, and your family has the added interest of the magnificent Ashcroft Garland, an object that would be remarkable in any setting." A brief silence fell over the table at this mention of the garland. Lady Blackwood's hand, reaching for her wineglass, paused in mid-air. Sir Edmund's expression darkened. Eleanor became very still, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. It was Gerald Forsyth who broke the silence, his voice carrying a forced heartiness that failed to mask an underlying tension. "Ah, yes, the famous Garland, priceless, irreplaceable,
and utterly useless for any practical purpose. One cannot eat it, one cannot invest it, one cannot use it to pay one's creditors. It merely hangs on the wall, beautiful and sterile, while the family struggles to maintain a house that is far too large for modern life.
Gerald, Lady Blackwood's voice was sharp. That is quite enough. The Garland is our heritage, our connection to 400 years of family history. It is not to be spoken of in such terms. Forgive me, Cousin Evelyn, but someone must speak plainly. The family faces ruin, and still you insist on clinging to relics of the past. If the Garland were sold, it would solve every financial difficulty the Blackwoods face. Sir Edmund could modernise the estate, invest in profitable ventures, secure Eleanor's future. Instead, we sit here pretending that everything is fine, while the walls crumble around us. Sir Edmund rose from his chair with such violence that his wine-glass toppled, spreading a crimson stain across the white tablecloth, like blood seeping through snow. You forget yourself, sir. You are a
Guest in this house, invited here through familial obligation, not through my own choice. The Garland will never be sold while I draw breath. It was entrusted to me by my father, as it was entrusted to him by his father, going back through the generations to the first Sir Edmund. I will not be the one to break that sacred trust. Even if maintaining that trust costs your daughter her inheritance. Even if it forces you into bankruptcy. Pride is an expensive luxury, Cousin Edmund.
Enough!
Major Thornton's voice cracked across the table like a whip.
Forsyth, you are a damned impudent puppy, and if we were anywhere but at my sister's table, I would call you out for your insolence. Edmund, sit down, man. We are all family here, and this is Christmas. Let us not allow financial matters to poison our celebration. But the damage had been done. The veneer of civility had been cracked, revealing the tensions that seethed beneath. Sir Edmund resumed his seat with poor grace, but the remainder of the dinner proceeded in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the Major's increasingly desperate attempts at cheerful conversation and Lady Blackwood's quiet directions to the servants. When the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, according to custom, leaving the gentlemen to their port and cigars, Poirot found himself studying his companions with renewed interest. Gerald Forsyth's outburst had been calculated, he felt certain, designed to provoke precisely the reaction it had received. But to what end? Was it merely the spite of a poor relation dependent on the charity of wealthier cousins? Or was there some deeper purpose at work? You disapprove of our little family drama, Monsieur Poirot? Sir Edmund's voice broke into his thoughts. The baronet's face was flushed, whether from wine or anger, Poirot could not determine. You think us savages for quarrelling at the dinner table? I think, Sir Edmund, that families are often the arena for the most powerful emotions, both love and hatred. I have observed that where great affection exists, great conflict may also exist, for the stakes are higher, the hurts deeper. Very diplomatic. But you have not answered my question. Do you think I am foolish to refuse to sell the Garland? Poirot considered his response carefully. I think that you are caught between two forms of responsibility, monsieur. The responsibility to the past, to honour the trust placed in you by your ancestors, and the responsibility to the future, to secure the well-being of your descendants. These responsibilities are not always compatible. But which should take precedence? That is the question that haunts me. Sir Edmund's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. My daughter deserves a proper settlement, a dowry that will allow her to marry well.
My estates require investment to remain productive. My debts press upon me with increasing urgency. And yet, every time I consider selling the garland, I feel as though I would be betraying. Everything my family has stood for, everything that gives meaning to our name and our history. Has anyone made you an offer for the garland? Sir Edmund's expression became guarded. There have been inquiries over the years, collectors, museums, even a representative of an American millionaire who wished to purchase it as a gift for his wife. I have refused them all. But recently, he paused, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. Recently, a London dealer has been most persistent. He claims to represent a private collector who is willing to pay £60,000 for the garland, substantially more than its estimated value. The offer is generous, perhaps too generous. It makes me suspicious. Before Poirot could pursue this revelation, Dr. Ashford coughed gently. Perhaps, Edmund, we should rejoin the ladies. It grows late, and I believe Miss Eleanor was planning to read from Dickens after dinner. A family tradition, I understand. The gentlemen made their way to the drawing room, where they found the ladies seated near the fire. Eleanor held a well-worn copy of A Christmas Carol, and at her mother's nod, she began to read, in a voice that trembled slightly at first, but grew stronger as she progressed through the familiar tale. Poirot listened with half his attention, the other half occupied with observing the assembled company. Major Thornton sat with his eyes closed. Whether sleeping or simply resting, Poirot could not determine. Gerald Forsyth had positioned himself where he could watch Eleanor's profile, his expression unreadable. Lady Blackwood's hands worked at some embroidery, her needle moving with mechanical precision, while her eyes remained fixed on her daughter. Sir Edmund stood by the window, looking out at the falling snow, his back to the room and his shoulders slumped with evident care. But it was Victoria Ashford who most drew Poirot's attention. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze not on Eleanor, but on the Ashcroft Garland above the mantelpiece. In her expression, Poirot read a complex mixture of emotions, longing and resentment, and something else, something almost like recognition or remembrance. What memories did the garland evoke for this quiet woman? What significance did it hold for her, beyond its obvious value and beauty? Eleanor's reading was interrupted by the arrival of the butler, Graves, an elderly man who had clearly served the family for many years. He approached Sir Edmund and spoke in a low voice, but Poirot's acute hearing caught the words, "urgent message," and "in the study, sir." Sir Edmund excused himself and departed, his expression troubled. The reading resumed, but the mood had been broken. When Eleanor reached the end of the chapter, Lady Blackwood rose and announced that it was time to retire, as they would be attending church in the morning for Christmas Eve services, weather permitting. The company dispersed to their rooms, candles were distributed, and the house began to settle into the quiet rhythms of night. Poirot made his way to his chamber, but he did not immediately prepare for bed. Instead, he stood at his window, looking out at the transformed landscape. The snow had temporarily ceased, and the moon had emerged from behind the clouds, casting a silvery light over the white expanse of the grounds. The beauty was undeniable, but it was the beauty of isolation, of separation from the ordinary world. Ashcroft Manor had become an island, cut off from help or escape. And somewhere within its ancient walls, someone was planning murder. He was still standing at the window when a scream shattered the quiet of the night. A cry of terror so piercing and desperate that it froze the blood. Poirot seized his dressing gown and rushed into the corridor,
where he found doors opening and startled faces emerging. The scream had come from Eleanor's room, and as Poirot hurried toward it, he encountered Lady Blackwood running from the opposite direction, her face white with fear. Eleanor's door stood open. Within, the young woman sat bolt upright in her bed, her face contorted with terror, pointing with a shaking hand toward the window. And there, hanging against the glass like some grotesque ornament, was a figure, a dark shape that swayed gently in the wind that had begun to rise again. For one horrible moment, Poirot thought it was a body. But then, his rational mind reasserted itself. It was a doll, or more precisely, a puppet, dressed in woman's clothing and bearing a crude approximation of a human face. But it was what hung around the puppet's neck that made Lady Blackwood cry out and stumble against the doorframe. It was a wreath, a circle of greenery adorned with berries, a cruel parody of the Ashcroft Garland. And pinned to the puppet's chest was a note, visible even from inside the room through the glass, bearing a single word in letters formed from newspaper clippings. Tonight. The household assembled in Eleanor's room within minutes, everyone speaking at once, theories and exclamations filling the air. Major Thornton wanted to go outside immediately to retrieve the puppet, but Poirot stayed him with a sharp command. "Non, monsieur. You will disturb any traces the perpetrator may have left. The snow makes an excellent record of movement. We must examine the ground below the window carefully before anyone approaches." "But the thing must be removed," Lady Blackwood protested. "Eleanor cannot sleep with that horror hanging outside her window." "Madame, your daughter will not sleep in this room tonight in any case," Poirot said firmly. "She must move to another chamber, one whose window faces a different direction, one that can be secured with certainty. But first, I must see the puppet in place, understand how it was hung, observe any details that might reveal the identity of who placed it there." Sir Edmund had brought a lamp, and with its aid, Poirot examined the window and its surroundings from the inside. The puppet had been hung from a hook that projected from the eaves above Eleanor's window, a hook whose original purpose was unclear, but which had provided a convenient anchor for the perpetrator's grisly prank. The rope that supported it was ordinary hemp, such as might be found in any stable or storage room. The puppet itself appeared to be constructed from sacking stuffed with straw, dressed in an old gown that might have come from any trunk or attic. "Tomorrow, in daylight, we shall examine the ground below and the method by which this was accomplished," Poirot announced. "For tonight, Mademoiselle Eleanor must be moved to a secure room, and we must all remain vigilant. This is not a prank. This is a threat, and it is a threat we must take with the utmost seriousness." Eleanor was moved to a guest room on the opposite side of the house, one whose door could be locked and whose window overlooked the front drive, rather than the secluded corner where the puppet had been hung. Lady Blackwood remained with her daughter, while the others returned reluctantly to their rooms. Only Poirot lingered in the corridor, his mind racing through possibilities. Who had hung the puppet? It would have required accessing the roof, or at least the upper reaches of the house, working in darkness and cold, taking the considerable risk of being observed or of falling. It suggested either great determination or great desperation. And the note, "Tonight." What did it mean? Was this the night Eleanor was meant to die? Or was it merely another psychological assault, designed to terrify and unbalance her before the actual attack came? Poirot did not return to his room. Instead, he took up a position in a chair at the end of the corridor, from which he could observe both Eleanor's new chamber and the main staircase. If anyone wished to approach the young woman during the night, they would have to pass him first. He settled himself as comfortably as the upright chair would allow, his mind alert despite the late hour, his every sense attuned to the sounds and movements of the old house settling around him. The hours passed slowly. Twice Poirot heard footsteps and tensed, but both times they proved to be servants going about their early morning duties. Dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky when he finally allowed himself to relax slightly, confident that no attack would come in daylight. Eleanor had survived the night, but the question remained: what would Christmas Eve bring? Christmas Eve dawned grey and cold, with fresh snow falling steadily and the wind picking up to create drifts that blocked the lower windows and made any thought of travel impossible. When Poirot descended to the breakfast room, he found the family already assembled, their faces drawn with fatigue and worry. Only Gerald Forsyth appeared to have slept well, attacking his eggs and bacon with evident appetite, while the others picked at their food with little enthusiasm. "Sir." Edmund rose as Poirot entered. "Monsieur Poirot, I must thank you for standing guard over my daughter last night. Graves tells me you remained in the corridor until dawn. Your dedication is greatly appreciated." "It was nothing, Sir Edmund. I am accustomed to such vigils. But now, with your permission, I should like to examine the ground below Mademoiselle Eleanor's original window and to inspect the puppet itself." "Of course. I shall accompany you. Thornton, will you join us?" The Major agreed readily, as did Dr. Ashford, who expressed professional concern about Eleanor's state of mind. The four men dressed warmly and ventured out into the bitter cold. The wind drove the snow into their faces, making progress difficult, but they persevered until they reached the spot below Eleanor's window. Poirot examined the snow with the meticulous attention to detail that characterized all his investigations. There were footprints, partially filled by fresh snow but still discernible, leading from a door at the rear of the house to a position directly below the window. The prints were large, suggesting a man rather than a woman, but beyond that, little could be determined. The perpetrator had stood in one spot for some time, evidenced by the depression in the snow, then had retreated by the same path, taking care to step in his previous footprints to minimize the trail. "Someone who thinks carefully," Poirot murmured. "Someone who plans and who takes precautions. This was not an impulsive act, but rather a calculated one." The puppet had been taken down and brought inside. In the harsh light of day, it appeared less sinister, merely a crude construction of sacking and straw. But the wreath around its neck and the note pinned to its chest retained their menacing quality. Poirot examined both carefully. The wreath was fashioned from holly and ivy, common enough plants in any English garden. But the berries had been arranged to create a pattern, alternating red and white, and the overall effect was clearly meant to echo the gold and emerald pattern of the Ashcroft Garland. Someone had taken considerable care with this detail, which suggested that the connection to the garland was central to the message being sent. The note was more troubling. The word "tonight" had been formed from letters cut from newspapers, just as Eleanor had described the earlier threatening letter. But these letters were from different publications, Poirot noted, suggesting either that the perpetrator had access to a variety of newspapers or had deliberately mixed sources to make tracing the origins more difficult. "Who in the household receives newspapers?" Poirot asked. "We take the Times and the local Kent paper," Sir Edmund replied. "But my study contains back issues going back several months. Anyone could have accessed them." "And who has been in your study recently?"
Sir Edmund's expression became uncomfortable. Nearly everyone, at one time or another. It is not kept locked. Forsyth has been using it to write letters. My brother-in-law often reads there. Dr. Ashford meets with me there to discuss business matters. Even Eleanor uses it occasionally when she wishes to write in quiet. A dead end, then, at least for the moment. Poirot turned his attention to other matters. Sir Edmund, last night you mentioned receiving an urgent message that called you away from the drawing room. What was the nature of this message? The baronet's face darkened. It was from my solicitor in London, delivered by special messenger before the snow made the roads completely impassable. He writes that my creditors are losing patience. Unless I can provide substantial payment within the month, they will be forced to begin proceedings to recover their debts. The house, the estates, everything could be lost.
And the solution your solicitor suggests?
He is aware of the offer for the Ashcroft Garland. He strongly urges me to accept it. The £60,000 would be sufficient to satisfy all debts and leave a comfortable surplus for investment. He says it is my duty to my family to accept, that sentiment cannot be allowed to override practical necessity.
And what do you say, Sir Edmund?
I say that I am caught in an impossible situation. If I sell the Garland, I betray my ancestors and the trust they placed in me. If I refuse to sell, I may lose everything and leave my daughter penniless. What choice is that? Major Thornton cleared his throat. Perhaps it is time for plain speaking, Edmund. The Garland is a beautiful object, but it is just an object. Your daughter, your family, your name, these are what truly matter. No one would condemn you for choosing your daughter's welfare over a piece of metalwork, however historically significant. You speak as one who has no such burden, Henry. You have no family legacy to maintain, no ancestral trust to uphold. It is easy to advise others to abandon their principles when one has none of one's own. The Major's face flushed with anger. By God, Edmund, if you were not my brother-in-law, I would demand satisfaction for such words.
Gentlemen,
Poirot's voice cut through the rising tension.
This is not productive. We are not here to discuss financial matters, but rather to investigate a threat against Mademoiselle Eleanor's life. Sir Edmund, has anyone else been made aware of this offer for the Garland?
Only my immediate family. I discussed it with my wife and daughter. And I suppose my solicitor's clerk must know, as he would have handled the correspondence.
And Mr. Forsyth? He seemed very well informed about your financial difficulties at dinner last evening.
Sir Edmund's expression became grim. Gerald has made it his business to pry into my affairs. I suspect he has been reading my correspondence, though I have no proof. He certainly makes free with his opinions on how I should manage my estate. They returned to the house, cold and discouraged. Poirot went immediately to Eleanor's new room, where he found her with her mother and Victoria Ashford. The young woman appeared haggard, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling as she poured tea.
Mademoiselle, Poirot said gently, I must ask you some questions. You mentioned in your note to me that you had received a threatening letter 3 days ago. When exactly did you receive it, and how was it delivered?
Eleanor sat down the teapot with an audible clatter.
It was the morning after our guests arrived. I found it on my dressing table when I woke. I have no idea how it got there. My door was locked, or at least I thought it was. But the letter was there, waiting for me. And the words. She shuddered. The words were horrible. They said I would die before Twelfth Night, that my blood would stain the snow, that the garland would be my doom.
And you burned this letter immediately?
Not immediately. I showed it to my parents first. But then I became frightened that someone might see it, that it would cause talk among the servants. So I burned it in my fireplace that evening.
A pity. Physical evidence can be most illuminating. But tell me, mademoiselle, why do you think someone wishes you dead? What have you done to inspire such hatred?
Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Nothing. I have done nothing. I am not a particularly interesting person, Monsieur Poirot. I live quietly. I read. I play the piano. I help my mother with her charitable work. I have no enemies, no romantic entanglements that might inspire jealousy, no great fortune to inherit that might inspire greed.
But you will inherit the Ashcroft Garland, will you not? As the only child of Sir Edmund, it will pass to you upon his death.
I suppose so, yes. But I would never sell it, no matter what difficulties we face. It belongs to the family. It always has and always should.
Poirot turned to Lady Blackwood.
And you, madame? What do you make of these threats against your daughter?
Lady Blackwood's composure cracked slightly.
I am terrified, Monsieur Poirot. Someone in this house, someone we know and perhaps trust, wishes to harm my daughter. I do not know who or why, but I know that it is real. That horrible puppet hanging outside her window, the note, the threats, these are not pranks. They are the prelude to something terrible.
Has Mademoiselle Eleanor any suitors? Anyone who might have been rejected and who harbours resentment?
There was a young man, a curate's son, who showed interest last summer.
Victoria Ashford spoke up quietly.
But Eleanor gently discouraged him, and he accepted her decision with good grace. He has since become engaged to someone else. I cannot imagine him involved in anything of this nature.
And Mr. Forsyth? He seems most attentive to Mademoiselle Eleanor.
Eleanor's face flushed. Gerald is a distant cousin, nothing more. He has made certain suggestions about a closer relationship, but I have made it clear that I have
no interest in such an arrangement. He is my father's poor relation, dependent on our charity, and I suspect his interest in me has more to do with my eventual inheritance than with any genuine affection.
Has he been persistent in his attentions, despite your discouragement?
Quite persistent. It has been most uncomfortable. But surely Gerald would not threaten my life. What would he gain? If I were to die, the garland would pass to my father's heir, whoever that might be, not to Gerald.
And who is your father's heir, in the absence of a son?
The title would go to a cousin in Yorkshire, a man my father has never met. The garland, however, is not entailed. My father could leave it to anyone he chose, though family tradition dictates it should pass to the next baronet.
Interesting. Most interesting indeed. If Eleanor died unmarried and childless, the Garland's fate would be uncertain, subject to Sir Edmund's will, rather than following the automatic course of primogeniture. This opened up a range of possibilities that Poirot's mind immediately began to explore. The morning passed in a series of interviews as Poirot systematically questioned each member of the household. Major Thornton admitted to having urged his brother-in-law to sell the Garland, arguing that sentiment should not override practical necessity. Dr. Ashford expressed deep concern for Eleanor's health, both physical and mental, and suggested that the stress of the situation might be causing her to imagine threats where none existed. His daughter, Victoria, spoke reluctantly about her own family's connection to the Blackwoods, revealing that her grandfather had been Sir Edmund's grandfather's business partner, a partnership that had ended badly, with the Ashfords losing their fortune while the Blackwoods retained theirs. Gerald Forsyth was the most difficult to interview. He affected a careless attitude toward the threats against Eleanor, suggesting that she was being overdramatic and that the puppet had probably been a prank by one of the servants. When pressed about his financial circumstances and his interest in Eleanor, he became defensive, insisting that his intentions were honourable and that he resented the implication that he was a fortune hunter. By the afternoon, Poirot had accumulated a substantial body of information, but the pattern remained elusive. Someone in the household had both opportunity and access to create the threats against Eleanor. Someone had knowledge of the house's layout and routines sufficient to place a letter on Eleanor's dressing table and to hang a puppet outside her window without being observed. But who? And more importantly, why? As evening approached, the household gathered in the drawing room for tea. The mood was subdued, the events of the previous night having cast a pall over what should have been a festive occasion. Lady Blackwood had decreed that they would attend the Christmas Eve service at the village church, despite the snow, believing that the spiritual comfort and the presence of the broader community would be beneficial. But when the time came to depart, it became apparent that the expedition would be impossible. The snow had accumulated to such a depth that the drive was completely blocked, and even if they could have reached the road, the vicar had sent word that services had been cancelled due to the weather. They were truly isolated now, cut off from any help or intervention from the outside world. Dinner that evening was a sombre affair. The traditional Christmas Eve feast had been laid out with all the ceremony the household could muster, but no one had much appetite. The conversation was desultory, and the silences grew longer and more uncomfortable as the meal progressed. It was with visible relief that Lady Blackwood finally rose and led the ladies back to the drawing room. Poirot remained behind with the gentleman, nursing a small glass of port and observing his companions. Major Thornton was drinking heavily, his face flushed and his voice growing louder with each glass. Gerald Forsyth sat apart, his expression sullen and resentful. Dr. Ashford watched them both with the clinical detachment of a physician observing symptoms in a patient. "Tell me, Dr. Ashford," Poirot said quietly, "as a medical man, what is your assessment of Mademoiselle Eleanor's condition?" The doctor considered his response carefully. "She is under severe strain, that much is evident. The threats, whether real or imagined, have taken a toll on her nerves. If the situation continues, I would not be surprised to see a complete nervous collapse. You say, whether real or imagined. Do you doubt the reality of the threats? I do not doubt that Eleanor believes herself to be in danger. Whether that danger is objectively real or is rather a manifestation of some internal anxiety, I cannot say with certainty. The human mind is capable of extraordinary self-deception, particularly under conditions of stress. And the puppet that hung outside her window, was that also imagined? Of course not, but it might have been placed there for reasons having nothing to do with Eleanor personally. Perhaps it was meant as a general threat or warning to the family. Perhaps it was indeed a prank that has been misinterpreted,
Or perhaps someone wishes to frighten Eleanor for reasons that have nothing to do with wishing her dead. Before Poirot could pursue this line of inquiry, Sir Edmund rose abruptly from the table. "Gentlemen, shall we join the ladies? I find myself in need of distraction from my troubles, and I believe my wife had planned some Christmas music for this evening." They returned to the drawing room, where they found the ladies assembled around the piano. Eleanor was to play, and Victoria to sing, a program that proceeded with determined cheerfulness, despite the underlying tension. But as midnight approached, and Lady Blackwood suggested that it was time to retire, Poirot observed that several members of the company appeared reluctant to end the evening, as if the communal gathering provided some protection against the threats that lurked in the darkness. Finally, however, the company dispersed. Candles were distributed, good-night wishes exchanged, and the household began to settle for the night. Poirot had arranged with Sir Edmund that he would once again maintain a watch over Eleanor's corridor, a suggestion that had been received with gratitude. As before, Poirot took up his position in the chair at the end of the hallway, prepared for a long night of vigilance. The house grew quiet around him, settling into the rhythms of sleep. 1 o'clock came and passed, then 2. Poirot fought against drowsiness, focusing his mind on the puzzle before him. Who wished Eleanor Blackwood dead? The question circled endlessly in his thoughts, seeking an answer. Gerald Forsyth might hope to marry her and gain control of her inheritance, but her death would achieve the opposite result. Major Thornton might wish the Garland sold to settle his brother-in-law's debts, but why threaten Eleanor rather than Sir Edmund? Victoria Ashford bore a grudge against the family for the old business reversal, but what would she gain from Eleanor's death? It was nearly 3 in the morning when Poirot heard the sound. It was faint, barely audible, but his trained senses caught it immediately. Footsteps, slow and careful, descending the main staircase. He rose silently from his chair and moved to a position where he could observe the landing while remaining in shadow. A figure emerged from the stairwell, carrying no candle, but moving with evident familiarity with the house's layout. In the faint moonlight that filtered through the windows, Poirot could not immediately identify the person, but the form suggested a man rather than a woman. The figure paused at the top of the stairs, seeming to listen, then moved purposefully toward Eleanor's new room. Poirot waited until the figure was committed to approaching the door, then stepped forward and spoke sharply. "Halt! Who goes there?" The figure whirled around, and in the moonlight, Poirot recognized Gerald Forsyth. The young man's face registered first shock, then fear, then a desperate attempt at nonchalance. "Monsieur Poirot, you startled me. I could not sleep and thought a walk might help." "A walk that brought you directly to Mademoiselle Eleanor's door? That is most interesting, Mr. Forsyth. Most interesting indeed." "I was not going to her door. I was merely passing by on my way to the library. I thought I might find a book to help me sleep." "At 3 in the morning, in the dark, without a candle, moving with stealth? Come, monsieur, you must think me very stupid indeed to accept such an explanation." Forsyth's expression hardened. "Think what you like. I am a guest in this house, free to move about as I please. You have no authority to question my movements." "Perhaps not." But Sir Edmund does. Shall we wake him and discuss this matter together? For a moment, Poirot thought Forsyth might refuse, might attempt to push past him or even resort to violence. But then the young man's shoulders slumped in defeat. Very well. But there is an innocent explanation, I swear it. They retired to the library, where Poirot lit several lamps and settled himself to listen. Forsyth paced the room nervously, his hands clenching and unclenching, before finally beginning to speak. You must understand my situation, Monsieur Poirot. I am entirely dependent on Edmund's charity. My father squandered our family's fortune, and I inherited nothing but debts. Edmund took me in out of family obligation, but he makes it clear every day that I am here on sufferance, that I contribute nothing and consume much. I am 30 years old, with no prospects, no income, and no hope of improving my situation. And you believe that marrying Mademoiselle Eleanor would solve your difficulties? Not merely solve them, it would restore my position in society, give me purpose and standing. Eleanor will inherit everything eventually. With her as my wife, I would have security, status, a future. Is it so terrible to wish for such things? It is not terrible to wish for security, monsieur, but to pursue a young woman who has made it clear she does not welcome your attentions, to approach her room in the middle of the night. These are not the actions of an honourable man. Forsyth's face flushed with anger and shame. I was not going to her room to harm her. I wanted to speak with her, to make her understand that I could protect her, that marriage to me would be advantageous. With these threats against her life, she must be frightened, vulnerable. I thought that if I could speak to her privately, away from her mother's influence, I could persuade her to see reason. And did it not occur to you that approaching a frightened young woman's bedroom in the middle of the night might terrify her further? That it might be seen as confirming her fears rather than allaying them? I had not thought of it in those terms. Forsyth slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. I am desperate, Monsieur Poirot, so very desperate. I see my life slipping away, opportunity after opportunity passing me by. Eleanor is my last hope, and she will not even listen to my suit. Poirot studied the young man with a mixture of pity and distaste. Desperation, he knew from long experience, could drive people to terrible acts. But was Forsyth desperate enough to threaten Eleanor, thinking that fear might drive her into his arms? It seemed unlikely. Such a strategy would more probably drive her away. But desperate men did not always think clearly. Mr. Forsyth, I must ask you directly. Have you been responsible for the threats against Mademoiselle Eleanor? The letters, the puppet, the warnings? No. I swear to you, no. I would never harm her, or even threaten her. She is my last hope, as I said. Why would I do anything to frighten or injure her? Perhaps to make her feel vulnerable, in need of protection that you could provide? I am not so foolish, or so cruel. Please, you must believe me. I am guilty of nothing more than poor judgment and desperation. I should not have approached her room tonight, I acknowledge that. But I am not a murderer or a terrorizer of women. Poirot dismissed him, finally, with a stern warning to remain in his own chamber for the rest of the night. Whether Forsyth was telling the truth, Poirot could not yet determine. The young man was certainly capable of stupidity and selfishness, but was he capable of the calculated campaign of terror that had been directed at Eleanor? The question remained open. The remainder of the night passed without incident, and when dawn came, bringing Christmas morning, the household assembled for breakfast with expressions of determined good cheer that fooled no one. Gifts were to be exchanged after breakfast, a tradition that Lady Blackwood insisted upon despite the circumstances. The presents were modest: handkerchiefs, books, small pieces of jewellery, but the ritual provided some sense of normalcy in an increasingly abnormal situation. It was as they were returning to the drawing room after breakfast that Poirot noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. The Ashcroft Garland,
which had hung above the mantelpiece since his arrival, was gone. In its place was an empty hook and a rectangular shadow on the wall where the garland's presence had protected the panelling from the darkening effects of smoke and time. "Sir Edmund!" Poirot's sharp exclamation brought the family running. "The garland! Where is it?" Sir Edmund's face went white. "It was there last night. I saw it before we retired. Someone has taken it." A frantic search ensued. Every room was examined, every servant questioned, every possible hiding place investigated. But the Ashcroft Garland had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. 400 years of family heritage, £50,000 of value, an object that had survived civil war and revolution, gone in a single night. It was Dr. Ashford who discovered the next horror. In the study, he found a note, pinned to Sir Edmund's desk with a letter opener. The note was brief, composed in the now familiar style of words cut from newspapers. "The garland is forfeit. Eleanor Blackwood will die at midnight on 12th night, unless my demands are met. Wait for instructions. Tell no one. Any attempt to contact authorities will result in her immediate death." The household assembled in the drawing room in a state of shock. Sir Edmund sat slumped in his chair, looking as though he had aged 10 years in as many minutes. Lady Blackwood wept quietly, while Eleanor sat beside her, her face blank with terror. The others stood or sat in stunned silence, the full implications of the theft gradually becoming clear. "We must contact
The police," Major Thornton declared. "This has gone beyond family matters. This is theft and extortion, and it requires the intervention of the law."
"But the note warns against contacting authorities," Lady Blackwood protested. "If we bring in the police, Eleanor will be killed."
"The threat may be a bluff designed to prevent us from seeking help," the Major argued. "We cannot allow ourselves to be intimidated by a criminal's demands."
"Enough,"
Poirot's voice cut through the debate.
Before we decide on any course of action, we must understand what we are dealing with. The theft of the garland and the threats against Mademoiselle Eleanor are connected. But the connection may not be as straightforward as it appears. I must have time to investigate, to examine the evidence, to understand the criminal mind we are confronting.
"Time is precisely what we do not have," Sir Edmund said heavily. 12th night is but 7 days away. If we cannot recover the garland and identify the villain by then, my daughter will die.
Then we must work quickly and methodically. Sir Edmund, I must ask you to gather the household together this afternoon. I wish to question everyone about their movements last night. Someone in this house took the garland. Someone who knew its location, its value, and its significance. We will find them, and we will recover what was stolen.
The morning of Christmas Day passed in a blur of activity as Poirot conducted his investigation. He examined the drawing room minutely, looking for any trace of how the garland had been removed. The hook from which it had hung was substantial, suggesting that removing the garland would have required both strength and time. Yet no one had heard anything unusual during the night, and Poirot himself, stationed in the corridor above, had heard nothing beyond Gerald Forsyth's ill-advised nocturnal wandering. The garland was large and heavy, Poirot learned from Sir Edmund, weighing perhaps 20 pounds in total. It could not have been easily concealed on one's person, which meant that the thief had either hidden it somewhere in the house
or had managed to remove it to the grounds despite the snow. But a search of the grounds revealed no disturbance beyond the original footprints from the puppet incident, and a thorough examination of the house's many rooms and closets revealed no trace of the missing treasure. In the afternoon, as promised, Poirot assembled the household in the library. One by one, he questioned them about their movements during the night, their knowledge of the Garland, their financial circumstances, and their relationships with Eleanor. The process was exhausting and yielded little in the way of concrete evidence, but Poirot's sharp mind was beginning to detect patterns, inconsistencies, and connections that had not been apparent before. Major Thornton admitted that he had financial interests in seeing the Garland sold, as he had invested money with Sir Edmund's estates and needed the debts repaid. Dr. Ashford revealed that his daughter Victoria had once been engaged to Sir Edmund's younger brother, who had died in the war, and that the Ashford family had expected her to become part of the Blackwood family, with all the financial security that implied. When the brother died, those expectations had died with him, leaving Victoria to face a life of genteel poverty as a physician's daughter. Gerald Forsyth, confronted about his midnight wandering, admitted his plan to appeal to Eleanor, but continued to insist that he had nothing to do with either the threats or the theft. Lady Blackwood revealed that she had grown up in reduced circumstances herself, marrying Sir Edmund partly for love, but also for the security his position offered, and that she was terrified at the prospect of returning to poverty. Even the servants were questioned, though Poirot quickly determined that none of them had the education or sophistication necessary to orchestrate the campaign of threats and theft. The threatening letters required a certain level of literacy and access to newspapers. The theft of the Garland required knowledge of its significance and value. The timing of the threats and the theft suggested someone familiar with the family's plans and routines. As evening fell on Christmas Day, Poirot retreated to his room to think. He had accumulated a vast quantity of information, but the pattern remained frustratingly elusive. Who had taken the Garland? Who had threatened Eleanor? And most puzzling of all, what was the connection between the two crimes? He was still pondering these questions when a knock came at his door. Opening it, he found Victoria Ashford standing in the corridor, her face pale but determined. "Monsieur Poirot, may I speak with you privately? There is something I must tell you, something that may be relevant to your investigation." Poirot invited her in and listened as she settled herself in the chair by the fire. When she finally began to speak, her voice was low but steady, the voice of one who has made a difficult decision and is determined to follow through despite the cost. "I have not been entirely honest about my family's connection to the Blackwoods," she began. "The business reversal I mentioned was more complex and more painful than I suggested. My grandfather and Sir Edmund's grandfather were indeed partners, but when financial difficulties arose, Sir Edmund's grandfather bought out my grandfather's share of the business for a fraction of its true value. My grandfather died shortly thereafter, broken by the betrayal, and my family was left nearly destitute." "But there is more, is there not?" Poirot prompted gently. "There is some further connection that troubles you." Victoria's hands twisted in her lap. "When I was engaged to Sir Edmund's brother, I learned certain things about the family, secrets that I was told I must keep if I wished to be accepted into their circle. One of those secrets concerned the Ashcroft Garland itself." Poirot leaned forward intently. "What secret, mademoiselle?" "The Garland is not what it appears to be. That is, it is a magnificent piece of craftsmanship, and it is very old. But it was not made for the first Sir Edmund Blackwood, and it was not a gift from Queen Elizabeth. Those are family legends, created to enhance the garland's value and significance. In truth, the garland was acquired by Sir Edmund's great-grandfather in the late 18th century from an Italian dealer, part of a larger collection of Renaissance artifacts.
And you know this how?
I found documents in the family archives while preparing to marry into the family. Letters, bills of sale, correspondence with dealers. I mentioned what I had discovered to my fiancé, and he was horrified. He made me swear never to reveal the truth, saying that the family's honour depended on maintaining the legend, that the garland's value derived as much from its supposed royal provenance as from its intrinsic worth.
And after your fiancé's death, you kept this secret?
What choice did I have? I had no proof, as he had made me return the documents to their place in the archives. Without evidence, any claim I made would be dismissed as the spite of a disappointed woman. But now, with the garland stolen and Eleanor's life threatened, I wonder if the truth about the garland's origins might be relevant. Poirot considered this revelation carefully. If the Ashcroft Garland's royal provenance was a fabrication, its value would be diminished, though it would still command a substantial sum based on its age and craftsmanship alone. But would this knowledge be sufficient motive for murder? Would someone kill to preserve a family legend or to expose a generations-old fraud?
Mademoiselle, who else knows the truth about the garland?
I cannot say with certainty. Sir Edmund's brother knew, obviously, and he may have confided in others. The archives where I found the documents are in the old tower room, accessible to anyone in the family with sufficient curiosity and persistence. It is possible that others have made the same discovery I did.
And the offer to purchase the garland for £60,000, might that be related to this secret?
Victoria's expression suggested that this was a connection she had not previously considered. I suppose it might. If someone knew the truth about the garland's origins, they might hope to purchase it before that truth became widely known and its value diminished. Or, conversely, they might hope to blackmail the family into selling it rather than face public exposure of the fraud. After Victoria departed, Poirot sat for a long time, staring into the fire, his fingers unconsciously smoothing his magnificent moustache as his little grey cells worked through the implications of what he had learned. The case was becoming clearer, though many details remained obscure, but he could begin to see the outline of the truth, the pattern that connected the threats, the theft, and the secrets that Ashcroft Manor had harboured for generations. The following morning, Boxing Day, dawned clear and bright, the snow sparkling in the winter sun. The household assembled for breakfast with faces that showed the strain of the past days. Sir Edmund announced that he had received another note, discovered on his breakfast tray, instructing him to prepare a payment of £30,000 in cash to be delivered in exchange for the garland and Eleanor's safety. The instructions for the exchange would follow.
£30,000? Sir Edmund's voice cracked. I do not have such a sum. Even if I sold everything that is not entailed, I could not raise more than 20,000, and that would take weeks or months. This is impossible.
Perhaps that is the point, Poirot suggested quietly. Perhaps the demand is designed to be impossible, so that when it is not met, the villain can justify whatever action they take next.
Then what are we to do? Simply wait for my daughter to be murdered?
No, monsieur. We are going to solve this mystery, recover the garland, and unmask the criminal. But to do so, I must have your complete cooperation and that of your family. There are questions I must ask, truths that must be revealed,
secrets that must be brought into the light.
What secrets? Lady Blackwood demanded. We have nothing to hide.
Do you not, madame? Then let me pose some questions. Dr. Ashford, you have continued to serve this family as their physician, despite the fact that they destroyed your father financially and that Sir Edmund's brother broke his engagement to your daughter. Why this loyalty to those who have caused your family such pain?
The doctor's face flushed. I am a physician. I serve my patients regardless of personal history. That is my duty.
A noble sentiment, but I wonder if there might be another reason. Tell me, Doctor, have you ever examined the Ashcroft Garland closely? Have you ever had reason to question its authenticity?
I am a physician, not an antiquarian. I have no expertise in such matters.
But your daughter has, does she not? Miss Victoria, you have studied art history. You would have the knowledge necessary to authenticate Renaissance metalwork. And more importantly, you have had access to the family archives, where the truth about the Garland's origins is documented. Victoria's face remained calm, but Poirot detected a slight tension in her posture. I have already told you what I know about the Garland's history. Indeed, you have. But you have not told me everything. For instance, you have not mentioned that you are the one who made contact with the London dealer, offering to sell him information about the Garland's true origins for a substantial fee. A gasp went around the room. Victoria's composure finally cracked. How did you... That is, I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, but I think you do, mademoiselle. You see, I made certain inquiries of my own, contacting art dealers in London to ask if anyone had recently approached them with information about the Ashcroft Garland. One dealer, Mr. Horace Pemberton, confirmed that a woman matching your description had visited his establishment 3 months ago, offering to provide documentation that would expose the Garland as a later acquisition rather than a royal gift. He declined to involve himself in such a scheme, finding it ethically dubious, but he remembered the encounter quite clearly. Victoria's hands clenched in her lap. Very well, yes, I approached a dealer. My father and I have struggled financially for years, and I thought that if the Blackwoods were going to profit from a lie, I might at least be compensated for revealing the truth. But nothing came of it. The dealer refused to help, and I abandoned the idea. Or did you? Perhaps you realized that direct exposure of the fraud would be less profitable than a more elaborate scheme. Perhaps you thought that if the Garland was stolen, its recovery could be negotiated for a substantial reward. Or perhaps you thought that by creating a climate of fear around Eleanor, you could pressure the family into selling the Garland quickly before anyone could investigate its provenance too carefully. That's absurd. I would never harm Eleanor. She has done nothing to me. Perhaps not, but she stands to inherit the Garland, and with it, the perpetuation of the lie that has enriched the Blackwoods while your family struggled in poverty. That might be motive enough for someone who has nursed a grudge for many years. Before Victoria could respond, Gerald Forsyth leaped to his feet. This is preposterous. If anyone here has reason to harm Eleanor, it is Major Thornton. He has been pressuring Edmund to sell the Garland for months, trying to get his investment returned. He has the most to gain from creating a situation so desperate that Edmund has no choice but to sell. The Major's face purpled with rage. You impudent puppy! I ought to thrash you. Yes, I want my investment returned, but I would never threaten my own niece to achieve it. How dare you suggest such a thing? Please, Lady Blackwood's voice rose above the accusations. Please, all of you, stop. This is tearing our family apart, which is perhaps exactly what the villain wants. Monsieur Poirot, surely you can determine who is responsible. You have investigated so many cases, you must have some idea. Poirot rose from his chair,
his small stature belying the authority he projected. "Indeed, madame, I do have an idea. In fact, I have more than an idea. I know who has threatened Mademoiselle Eleanor, who stole the Ashcroft Garland, and why. But before I reveal the truth, I must conduct one final test, one last examination of the evidence." He turned to Sir Edmund. "I must ask you to grant me access to the family archives in the tower room. There are documents I need to see, documents that will confirm my theory." "Of course. I shall accompany you." "No, I must go alone. But I would ask that everyone remain here in the drawing room until I return. No one is to leave. No one is to communicate with anyone outside this room. Is that understood?" The assembled company agreed reluctantly, and Poirot departed, leaving them to wait in tense silence. He climbed the narrow stairs to the old tower room, where centuries of family papers had been stored in trunks and cabinets. With methodical precision, he began to search through the documents, looking for the evidence that would either confirm or refute his theory. It took nearly 2 hours, but finally he found what he sought. Letters, bills of sale, and, most damning of all, a diary entry from Sir Edmund's great-grandfather describing the purchase of the garland from an Italian dealer. The royal provenance was indeed a fabrication, created to enhance the garland's value and the family's prestige. But it was another document that truly shocked Poirot. A letter that revealed a secret even darker than the fraud surrounding the garland. As he read it, his face grew grave, and he understood at last the full complexity of the crime he was investigating. This was not simply about theft or extortion. This was about revenge, justice, and sins that had been hidden for generations. He returned to the drawing room, carrying a leather portfolio containing the documents he had discovered. The assembled company looked up expectantly as he entered, their faces reflecting various degrees of anxiety, hope, and fear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, "I am now ready to reveal the truth about the threats against Mademoiselle Eleanor and the theft of the Ashcroft Garland. But I warn you, the truth is more complex and more disturbing than anyone has suspected. This crime has its roots not in the present, but in the past, in secrets that have been kept for far too long." He opened the portfolio and withdrew the first document. This is a bill of sale dated 1789, recording the purchase of the Ashcroft Garland by the then Sir Edmund Blackwood from a dealer in Florence. As Miss Victoria Ashford has already revealed, the garland was not made for the first Sir Edmund, nor was it a gift from Queen Elizabeth. That story is a complete fabrication, designed to enhance the garland's value and the family's status. Sir Edmund's face went white, but he said nothing. Poirot continued. "But the fraud concerning the garland's provenance, while significant, is not the true crime I am here to expose. The true crime is much older and much darker. This letter, written by the same great-grandfather who purchased the garland, reveals that he did not merely buy out his business partner's share of their joint enterprise. He actively sabotaged the partnership, diverting funds, falsifying records, and ultimately driving his partner to financial ruin and suicide." Dr. Ashford rose slowly from his chair, his face stricken. "My grandfather, he died by his own hand." "I am afraid so, Doctor. The official story was that he died of a sudden illness, but this letter makes clear that he took his own life after discovering the extent of the betrayal. And the truly damning part of this letter is that it reveals the motive for the betrayal. Your grandfather had discovered that Sir Edmund's great-grandfather was engaged in smuggling. using their legitimate business as a front for illegal activities. When he threatened to expose these crimes, he was systematically destroyed. A heavy silence fell over the room. Lady Blackwood broke it with a trembling voice.
What does this have to do with the present crimes? Why tell us these terrible things about events that happened over a century ago?
Because, madam, the past is never truly past. The sins of our ancestors cast long shadows, and sometimes those shadows fall upon the innocent. Someone discovered this letter, learned of the injustice done to the Ashford family, and decided to exact revenge. Someone who has access to the house, knowledge of the family, and a motive born of old grievances. All eyes turned to Dr. Ashford and his daughter. The doctor's face was ashen, but he shook his head slowly. I knew nothing of this. Nothing. If what you say is true, then my family has been the victim of a terrible injustice. But I did not know. I swear it. I believe you, Doctor. But someone else in this household did know. And that someone has been orchestrating this elaborate scheme. The threats against Eleanor, the theft of the Garland, the demands for ransom, all of it designed to force the Blackwood family to face the consequences of their ancestors' crimes. Poirot paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled company before finally settling on one person. Major Thornton, I believe it is time for you to explain your actions. The Major's face, already flushed from drink and emotion, turned a deeper shade of crimson. What? This is outrageous! I have done nothing! On the contrary, Major, you have done a great deal. You have carefully constructed this entire scheme, beginning months ago when you, accidentally, discovered the documents in the tower room while ostensibly searching for military records that Sir Edmund had offered to lend you. You learned both about the fraudulent provenance of the Garland and about the injustice done to the Ashford family. And you saw an opportunity. An opportunity for what? This is madness. An opportunity to accomplish several objectives at once. First, to force Sir Edmund to sell the Garland and repay the money you had invested with him. Money you desperately needed because your own finances were in disarray due to gambling debts. Second, to exact a measure of justice for the Ashford family, whom you had always liked despite your brother-in-law's treatment of them. And third, to position yourself as the saviour who recovers the Garland and rescues Eleanor, thereby securing your sister's gratitude and perhaps even a reward from Sir Edmund. Major Thornton's bluster was collapsing. You cannot prove any of this. It is mere speculation. Is it? Then perhaps you can explain how you knew the exact weight and dimensions of the Garland. Information you let slip during our conversation yesterday. Information that would only be known to someone who had handled it recently, who had removed it from its hook and hidden it away. Or perhaps you can explain the traces of gold leaf I found on your sleeve cuff. Microscopic traces that match the Garland's surface. The Major looked down at his cuff, then back at Poirot, his face a mixture of defiance and despair. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, his shoulders slumped, and he sank into his chair. You are too clever by half, Monsieur Poirot. Very well. Yes, I took the Garland. But I meant no real harm to Eleanor. You must believe that. The threats were designed only to frighten, to create urgency, to force Edmund's hand. I never intended for anyone to be actually hurt. And yet, you put a young woman through days of terror, made her fear for her life, drove her to the edge of nervous collapse. These are not the actions of a man who means no harm, Major. I was desperate.
My debts were crushing me. Edmund's investment returns were all that stood between me and complete ruin. But he kept delaying, kept finding excuses not to liquidate assets. The Garland was the solution to everyone's problems. Edmund could settle his debts, I could retrieve my investment, the Ashfords could receive some recompense for past injustices. It was a perfect solution. Except that it was built on terror and extortion. Tell me, Major, where is the Garland now? The Major hesitated, then made his decision. It is hidden in the old priest hole in the chapel. I thought it a fitting place, a secret chamber in a sacred space. I planned to discover it there after a few more days of searching, claiming to have followed some clue you had overlooked. I would be the hero, and everyone would be so relieved that they would not question too closely how I had found it. Sir Edmund rose and crossed to his brother-in-law, his face a mixture of anger and disappointment. Henry, how could you? After all we have been through together, after all my sister has done for you, how could you terrorize our daughter for money? I told you I never meant real harm. I thought if Eleanor was frightened enough, she might even encourage you to sell the Garland. I thought the end would justify the means. The end never justifies such means, Poirot said firmly. You have committed serious crimes, Major. Theft, extortion, terroristic threats. These are not mere pranks or desperate measures. They are violations of law and trust that will have consequences. Lady Blackwood began to weep. My own brother. Henry, how could you betray us so completely? I am sorry, Evelyn. Truly sorry. I lost my way. The debts, the pressure, the shame of being dependent on Edmund's charity. It all became too much. I convinced myself that I was helping, that forcing Edmund to face reality and sell the Garland was the kindest thing I could do. But I see now that I was merely serving my own interests and calling it justice. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. The Ashcroft Garland was retrieved from its hiding place in the chapel, where it had indeed been concealed in the ancient priest hole. Major Thornton was confined to his room, pending a decision on whether to turn him over to the authorities or handle the matter privately within the family. Dr. Ashford and his daughter, learning the full truth of the injustice done to their family, struggled to process this revelation and its implications. By evening, the household had achieved a fragile calm. Sir Edmund gathered the company in the drawing room, where the Ashcroft Garland once again hung in its place of honour above the mantelpiece. But the sight of it no longer brought simple pride or pleasure. It had been tainted by the revelations of fraud and by the knowledge of the suffering it had caused. Monsieur Poirot, Sir Edmund began, I cannot adequately express my gratitude for what you have done. You have saved my daughter from terror, recovered the family's treasure, and exposed truths that we needed to face, however painful they might be. I did only what justice required, Sir Edmund. But now you face difficult decisions about how to proceed. What will you do about the Garland? Will you continue to maintain the fiction of its royal provenance, or will you acknowledge the truth? Sir Edmund looked at the Garland for a long moment before responding. I will acknowledge the truth. The Garland is a magnificent work of Renaissance craftsmanship, valuable in its own right, without the need for invented legends. And I will do something else as well. I will sell it, but not to settle debts. I will sell it and use half the proceeds to establish a trust for Dr. Ashford's family. Some small recompense for the terrible wrong that was done to them.
It is long past time that the Blackwoods faced their history honestly and made what amends they can.
That is most generous, Edmund, Dr. Ashford said quietly. Though nothing can undo the past, it is a gesture that honours your grandfather's memory while acknowledging the harm he caused. And your brother? Poirot asked. What will become of Major Thornton?
Lady Blackwood spoke, her voice heavy with sorrow.
He will leave Ashcroft Manor and will not be welcome to return. We will not press charges for the sake of our mother's memory and out of consideration for what he once was to us. But the trust is broken beyond repair. He must face the consequences of his actions in his own way.
The following day, Poirot prepared to depart Ashcroft Manor. The snow had begun to melt, and the roads, while still difficult, were passable.
He stood in the entrance hall. Eleanor approached him shyly. Monsieur Poirot, I wanted to thank you personally. You saved my life, or at least saved me from continued terror. I was so frightened, so alone, and you came when I called. I shall never forget that.
You are a brave young woman, Mademoiselle Eleanor. You endured much, and you did not allow fear to destroy you. That takes great courage.
Will I ever feel safe again? Will I ever be able to trust people as I once did?
Time will heal these wounds, mademoiselle. You will learn to trust again, though perhaps more carefully, more wisely. And that is not altogether a bad thing. Wisdom born of experience, even painful experience, is valuable. As Poirot's hired car made its way down the drive, he looked back at Ashcroft Manor one final time. The old house stood solid and enduring, as it had stood for centuries, weathering storms both literal and figurative. But the family within had been changed by the events of these past days, forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their heritage and themselves. The Ashcroft Garland would be sold, its golden leaves and emerald berries dispersed to some new owner who would value it for what it truly was, rather than for the legends that had surrounded it. The Ashford family would receive some measure of justice for the wrongs done to their ancestors, and Major Thornton would begin the long process of facing the consequences of his desperation and his crimes. As for Hercule Poirot, he settled back into the car's seat, his magnificent moustache perfectly symmetrical, his mind already turning to the comfortable routine of his London flat and the inevitable arrival of the next mystery that would require the services of his little grey cells. For such was the nature of his calling. Where there was injustice, where there was crime, where there was the complex tangle of human motive and action, there he would go, bringing to bear his unique combination of observation, deduction, and understanding of the human heart. The snow continued to melt as the car made its way toward London, revealing the green fields beneath, a reminder that winter, no matter how harsh or how long, eventually gives way to spring. And so too, Poirot reflected, did the darkness of crime and deception eventually give way to the light of truth and justice, if only one was patient enough and clever enough to see the case through to its conclusion.